A small town in the Midwest of the United States, surrounded by endless fields and sparse forests, seemed like an ideal place for a quiet and measured life. Everything went according to schedule here. Morning services at the local church, Sunday dinners with families, evening walks along the central square where residents greeted each other like old friends. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and life went on as usual. The church was the center of the town's spiritual life. Its pastor, Father John, was a true icon of the community, a tall, fit man of about 45. He was known for his openness and willingness to listen to everyone. His soft voice, caring advice, and sincere devotion to service made him the most respected man in the area. People trusted him with their innermost thoughts. He baptized their children, performed marriage ceremonies, and helped them in difficult times. His impeccable reputation and charismatic influence made him virtually untouchable in the eyes of most. Among the churchgoers was 17-year-old Emily, a modest, good-natured girl. She grew up in this town, was always a diligent student, and a helper in church affairs. Her older sister went to college, and her father worked on a nearby farm, leaving most of the household chores to her mother and Emily herself. The girl was always drawn to spiritual life, and being raised in a religious family, she saw Father Johnson as her mentor and support during her difficult teenage years. Emily was a diligent parishioner and often attended church events, from charity dinners to Sunday school classes. However, behind the facade of religious piety, there was another side. Teenage doubts, anxieties, and emotional ups and downs began to haunt her more and more often. Emily felt lonely, unable to find support among her peers. She saw in Father Johnson someone she could confide in, someone who would help her find answers to the questions that were tormenting her. At that time, this was the beginning of her gradual reproach with the priest. Father Johnson, noticing Emily's emotional uncertainty, offered to talk to her after the service. He saw in her a young soul who needed guidance and direction. He said he wanted to help her deal with her inner conflicts and find answers through faith. Their first conversations, held within the walls of the church, seemed innocent and even helpful. Father Johnson inspired her to spread goodness and light, spoke of spiritual quests, and of the importance of finding one's way in life. Emily, under his influence, began to stay after services more and more often for private conversations with Father Johnson. She shared her fears, doubts, and hopes. Father Johnson spoke to her about the importance of spiritual growth and how religion could help her cope with difficulties. Emily took his words as truth, seeing in him not only a pastor but also a wise mentor who could help her find herself in this difficult world. But with each meeting, their conversations became more personal. Something in Father Johnson's behavior began to seem unusual. There was something understated in his looks and words, subtle hints that their connection went beyond the usual spiritual relationship between a priest and a parishioner. Emily, being young and inexperienced, did not immediately realize that she had fallen into a trap of manipulation and dependency. She began to trust the priest more than anyone else and could not understand that, with each passing day, she was falling deeper into a dangerous game whose rules were not hers to control. On the outside, to the rest of the community, Father Johnson remained as revered and respected as ever. No one suspected that behind the facade of piety and virtue lurked something dark, something that would soon lead to a tragedy that would change life in this small town forever. As Father Johnson began to pay special attention to Emily, their meetings gradually became more than just spiritual instruction. Their conversations, which had initially focused on faith and life, began to delve into personal and intimate matters. Emily, being young and naive, accepted this as something natural, as if their relationship was blessed by the church itself. Her trust in the priest grew, and with each meeting, she felt more and more dependent on his attention and approval. Father Johnson was a master at manipulating the situation. He told Emily that he understood her better than anyone else. He told her that she was special, different from everyone else. These were simple but powerful words for a girl who was looking for understanding and support in a world where she often felt alone and lost. The priest became more than just a spiritual mentor, but someone who she felt truly cared about her spiritual well-being. Their meetings became more frequent. Father Johnson would invite her to stay after evening services to talk privately. These meetings took place in his study at the church, where there was silence and privacy. He always left the door closed so that no one would suspect anything was wrong. But each time, their conversations became more and more frank. Emily shared her inner fears and doubts with him. She talked about the difficulties in her relationship with her parents, about the misunderstanding from her peers, and about how difficult it was for her to find her place in the world. Father Johnson listened to her attentively, pretending to be completely immersed in her experiences. He increasingly convinced her that he was the one who could help her find the answers to all her questions, and her emotional vulnerability became the key to his control over her. The priest seemed to know how to push the right buttons. He often spoke of the world as a place of temptation and danger, and that it was through him that she could escape sin and find the true path. His talk of faith and salvation was intertwined with personal hints that their connection was unique and that she was the chosen one. Father Johnson told her that her faith and devotion to God made her special in his eyes. These words filled Emily with a sense of importance and significance that she had been missing in her everyday life. Over time, their meetings became more than just conversations. Father Johnson began touching her hand, hugging her, saying that it was simply a gesture of comfort and support. At first, Emily did not see anything suspicious in this. She thought that it was an expression of care from a man she trusted completely. But gradually, his touches became more and more invasive, and it became difficult for her to ignore this physical contact. Emily, however, was confused. She didn't know what to feel. On the one hand, she was tormented by her conscience. She knew that something was wrong in this relationship, but she couldn't pinpoint what exactly. On the other hand, she was immersed in a sense of dependence on the priest. His words and actions made her psychologically vulnerable, and she felt that she couldn't cope with life's difficulties without him. To the rest of his parishioners and townspeople, Father Johnson continued to be the same respected and devoted minister. No one could have guessed that something dark was hiding behind his respectable mask. People came to him for spiritual support, and he continued to play the role of the ideal pastor, caring and wise. However, no matter how masterfully he concealed his true nature, some things still began to arouse suspicion. Several parishioners began to notice that Emily was spending too much time with Father Johnson. She was increasingly staying after services. Her behavior became withdrawn, and her interactions with friends and family diminished. Her mother tried several times to talk to her daughter about what was happening, but Emily, immersed in fear and dependence on the priest, avoided the conversation. Father Johnson told her that no one would understand their relationship and that they should keep it a secret. With each passing day, their relationship became more and more painful for Emily. She was caught up in conflicting emotions: love, dependence, fear, and shame. Father Johnson kept telling her that it was okay, that she should trust him, and that their relationship was something sacred, not to be discussed with other people. Emily didn't realize that she was trapped in manipulation and control, and that her life was slowly falling apart. The turning point was approaching. Emily increasingly felt stuck. She didn't know how to get out of this situation, but she felt that something had to change. She began to avoid meetings with the priest. Her internal conflict was growing, but she could not yet find a way to end this relationship. Father Johnson, seeing her attempts to distance herself, began to put even more pressure on her, which would soon lead to tragedy. Emily, as she became increasingly immersed in her own personal struggles and inner conflicts, continued to rely on Father Johnson as the only person she felt could understand her. These meetings became her only escape from the cycle of anxieties she could not share with friends or family. But with each passing day, her connection with the priest crossed the line into what could no longer be called spiritual guidance. Father Johnson, with his keen insight into human psychology, used this knowledge to exert more control over Emily. He gradually began to instill in her the idea that their communication must remain secret. He said that no one would understand their special connection and that others might judge her for opening her soul to him. These words became an alarm signal for Emily, but she could not understand her feelings. On the one hand, she felt an internal protest, but on the other, her dependence on the priest only grew stronger. Their meetings began to happen more often and in private. Father Johnson convinced Emily that this was necessary for her spiritual growth so that she could understand herself. The girl believed his words, perceiving him as an authority capable of showing her the right path. However, she began to notice that these meetings were changing. Father Johnson's behavior increasingly showed signs that he was crossing the boundaries of spiritual communication. The physical contact that Emily had initially felt was a natural expression of care became increasingly intrusive. He began to touch her hands, to hug her longer than was necessary for simple comfort. Emily felt discomfort, but she did not dare to say so, afraid of offending the priest. She believed that he was doing this out of care and an attempt to help her cope with her internal problems. Tension gripped the investigation as detectives pored over every detail. The faint bloodstains in the church office, Emily's withdrawn behavior, and the surveillance footage they were beginning to analyze all pointed to something deeper. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Father Johnson's anxiety grew, though outwardly he maintained his calm demeanor, attending services, offering prayers, and counseling the community, skillfully concealing his inner turmoil. As forensic analysis of the blood came back, it matched Emily's, confirming that the church office had indeed been the site of violence. Investigators intensified their scrutiny of Father Johnson. More witnesses came forward with observations of late-night meetings between the priest and Emily, painting a picture of a relationship that went far beyond spiritual mentorship. A narrative of manipulation and coercion began to emerge. The investigation took a turn when police found a witness, a parishioner who had observed strange behavior from Father Johnson the night of Emily's disappearance. She recalled seeing him leaving the church late, looking disheveled and nervous. This corroborated what detectives had suspected. Father Johnson was not the holy man everyone thought he was. Pressure mounted, and Father Johnson could feel the walls closing in. His once perfect facade was beginning to crack. A thorough search of his private quarters yielded further evidence, a piece of Emily's jewelry hidden away, along with disturbing letters exchanged between the two. It was clear now that this was not just a murder, it was the culmination of a deeply abusive relationship built on control and manipulation. Father Johnson was finally arrested, his attempts to maintain innocence crumbling under the weight of the evidence against him. The town was left in shock, struggling to reconcile the image of their beloved priest with the monster he had been revealed to be. Emily's family, devastated, found some solace in the fact that the truth had finally come to light. The community mourned the loss of the young girl whose life was stolen by someone she trusted, and the case became a haunting reminder of the dangers lurking behind even the most trusted figures. Father Johnson, once revered, now faced the full force of the law as he awaited trial for his heinous crimes. Father Johnson's arrest sent shockwaves through the town. The man who had once been a pillar of the community was now exposed as a predator who had used his position to manipulate and ultimately destroy a vulnerable young girl. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and the townspeople were left grappling with feelings of betrayal and confusion. Emily's family, though heartbroken, felt a sense of grim closure. They had spent days in agonizing uncertainty, hoping for her safe return, only to have their worst fears realized. The revelations about her secret relationship with Father Johnson were almost too much to bear. Her mother, once a devout parishioner, could barely bring herself to step inside the church. The weight of knowing that their daughter had suffered in silence, unable to escape the priest's grasp, haunted them. As the case moved forward, more details of Father Johnson's manipulation tactics surfaced. Testimonies from other parishioners, particularly young women, hinted at a pattern of inappropriate behavior and emotional control. Some recounted how Father Johnson would counsel them privately, gaining their trust before crossing lines under the guise of spiritual guidance. Emily, it seemed, was not his only victim, though tragically, she had paid the ultimate price. The trial garnered widespread media attention, drawing reporters from neighboring towns and cities. The courtroom was filled with Emily's family, her friends, and other community members, all eager to see justice served. Father Johnson's defense tried to paint him as a troubled man who had become misguided in his duties, but maintained that Emily's death was an accident brought on by a moment of panic. However, the overwhelming evidence, including the blood found in the church office, the candlestick used in the attack, and Father Johnson's erratic behavior in the days following Emily's death, painted a much darker picture. Throughout the trial, Emily's diary was introduced as evidence. In it, she had documented her growing discomfort with Father Johnson's control over her, her fear of being exposed, and her increasing desperation to end the relationship. Her final entries were heart-wrenching, describing the emotional torment she endured, torn between fear and the need to reclaim her life. Father Johnson, once composed and confident, began to unravel on the stand. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he had never intended to harm Emily, but his attempts to justify his actions only deepened the horror of the situation. His manipulation and abuse of power became undeniably clear to all present. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Father Johnson was convicted of Emily's murder, as well as other charges related to his abuse of authority and the emotional manipulation of his parishioners. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town, though relieved that justice had been served, would never be the same. The trust in the church had been irrevocably broken. Many parishioners left, unable to reconcile their faith with the horror of what had occurred within its walls. Others, including Emily's family, sought therapy and counseling to cope with the trauma. As time passed, a small memorial was erected near the church in Emily's honor, a reminder of the innocent life that had been lost and the dark secret that had plagued the town. Her story became a symbol of the importance of speaking out against abuse and the dangers of blind faith in authority figures. The legacy of Father Johnson's crimes remained a scar on the town, but it also sparked conversations about accountability, trust, and the protection of the vulnerable. Emily's story, though tragic, ultimately led to greater awareness and vigilance, ensuring that such an atrocity would never happen again in their community. Emily's parents worked with local organizations to create a foundation in her name, aimed at helping young people in crisis and providing resources for those in emotionally or spiritually abusive relationships. Her memory lived on as a beacon of hope for those who felt trapped, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is a way out. After Father Johnson's erratic behavior during services, the police had enough reason to intensify their investigation. His uncharacteristic nervousness and the circumstantial evidence piling up against him had shifted the public's perception. The once beloved priest was now the subject of widespread suspicion and fear. Soon after, a breakthrough came when one of the priest's aides confided in the investigators. The aide recalled seeing Father Johnson returning to the church late at night, around the time of Emily's disappearance, looking disheveled and agitated. This odd behavior added weight to the theory that he had been involved in Emily's death. The investigation now focused heavily on reconstructing the timeline of events leading up to and immediately following Emily's disappearance. They looked into the days Father Johnson had altered his schedule, spoke with more parishioners, and examined his personal records. A damning piece of evidence emerged when one of Emily's close friends came forward, revealing that Emily had once confided in her about her discomfort around Father Johnson. Emily had expressed that his mentorship had become increasingly controlling, and she was afraid of what might happen if she tried to break free. With this new testimony, combined with the forensic evidence from the church office, Emily's hair, blood, and deleted messages, the police had enough to formally arrest Father Johnson. His calm demeanor finally cracked when the officers arrived at the church to take him into custody. In front of a small congregation, Father Johnson was handcuffed, and the news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the town. The trial was swift but emotionally charged. Emily's family sat through the proceedings, surrounded by friends and supporters. The prosecution laid out the case. Father Johnson had manipulated Emily emotionally and spiritually, and when she had tried to distance herself from him, he had resorted to violence. His power and influence over Emily had spiraled out of control, leading to her tragic death. Throughout the trial, Father Johnson maintained his innocence, insisting that the blood and hair found in his office were from unrelated, minor incidents. But his defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence, especially when the deleted messages and phone records were presented. These communications painted a picture of a secret relationship that had become increasingly tense in the weeks leading up to Emily's death. In the end, the jury found Father Johnson guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought some closure to Emily's grieving family, though the scars of her death would remain with them forever. The town struggled to move forward in the wake of the revelations. Many parishioners left the church, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal they felt. Emily's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of listening to those who may be suffering in silence. Emily's family, determined to honor her memory, established a foundation in her name aimed at helping young people escape toxic relationships and find support. Though Emily was gone, her story became a beacon of hope for others, ensuring that her death would not be in vain. Despite the trial's conclusion, the community continued to grapple with the aftermath of Father Johnson's betrayal. Emily's family, though relieved by the verdict, was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. In the weeks following the trial, they began receiving an outpouring of support from people across the country. Many shared stories of their own struggles with controlling figures, inspired by Emily's tragic story to speak up and seek help. The foundation in Emily's name quickly gained momentum, offering counseling, legal support, and educational resources for young people in difficult or manipulative relationships. Emily's mother, in particular, took an active role, speaking at schools, community centers, and even national platforms. Her message was clear: no one should have to face such struggles in silence, and there are always people who will listen and help. As time passed, the town slowly began to heal. The church, once a symbol of unity and community, was now seen as a place of darkness. Its congregation dwindled, and eventually, the diocese sent a new priest to take over. Though some parishioners returned, others could not forget the horrors that had taken place there. Father Johnson's former church remained a somber reminder of how trust can be exploited. Emily's friends and classmates, still young and coming to terms with her loss, organized a memorial service every year on the anniversary of her death. It became a time to remember Emily for the bright and kind person she had been, rather than the victim of a terrible crime. Each year, they gathered to share stories about her, celebrating the life she had lived, and the strength her story had inspired in others. Father Johnson, meanwhile, spent his remaining years in prison. Isolated from the outside world, he continued to proclaim his innocence to anyone who would listen. But his protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence was irrefutable, and the stain of his crime would never be washed away. Inside the prison walls, he became just another inmate, a fallen figure of authority who had used his position to manipulate and destroy. Years later, Emily's story was adapted into documentaries and true crime specials, capturing the attention of audiences worldwide. Her case became a symbol of the dangers of manipulation, secrecy, and unchecked power within trusted institutions. Many who watched or read about her story were reminded of how easily abuse can be hidden beneath a facade of respectability and how important it is to question and challenge even those in positions of authority. For Emily's family, though the pain of her loss never fully disappeared, they found comfort in knowing that her legacy had made a difference. The foundation grew to help hundreds of young people, and Emily's mother took solace in the fact that her daughter's life, though cut tragically short, had led to change and awareness. The town, too, eventually recovered, though it was forever changed. New families moved in, and slowly, the old stories of Father Johnson and Emily faded into the background. But for those who had lived through it, the memory remained sharp, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of betrayal. Emily's legacy, however, would endure far beyond the town. Her name became synonymous with the fight against coercive relationships, and her story continued to inspire those who felt powerless to reclaim control of their lives. As the trial loomed, the town's unease deepened. The shock of Father Johnson's arrest reverberated not only through the local church but across the broader community. The trial, which everyone knew would be highly publicized, became a focal point of gossip, with various versions of the priest's relationship with Emily circulating in hushed whispers. Emily's parents, still mourning their daughter, found it difficult to reconcile their previous trust in the church with the reality that their daughter had fallen victim to someone in such a respected position. During the trial, the prosecution laid out a compelling case against Father Johnson, outlining the accumulation of damning evidence that pointed to his guilt. The DNA traces on the candlestick, the phone records revealing secret and frequent communications, and testimonies from parishioners who had witnessed strange behavior were all brought forward. The prosecution painted a picture of a manipulative man who had used his position of trust to control and eventually harm Emily. The defense, on the other hand, sought to discredit the evidence, claiming that there were alternative explanations for Emily's presence in Father Johnson's office and the DNA on the candlestick. They argued that Emily, in her emotional distress, might have injured herself, and that her relationship with the priest had been blown out of proportion by gossip and misinterpretations. Father Johnson's lawyer sought to portray him as a man dedicated to his parish, someone who had been caught up in a tragic misunderstanding. As the trial progressed, Emily's secret life came to the forefront, with investigators showing how Father Johnson had played a pivotal role in her emotional decline. Witnesses spoke of how Emily had become increasingly withdrawn and troubled in the months before her death. Her once vibrant spirit had dimmed, replaced by a girl struggling with internal conflicts that no one, not even her parents, fully understood. But the most damning moment came when the prosecution presented the deleted messages exchanged between Father Johnson and Emily. Though brief and cryptic, they suggested an inappropriate and secret relationship that went beyond spiritual guidance. Coupled with the fact that Emily's blood and hair were found in the priest's office, the jury began to see the full extent of Father Johnson's manipulation. When Father Johnson took the stand, his demeanor was markedly different from the calm and confident priest people had known. Under the pressure of cross-examination, he struggled to maintain his innocence. His denials grew weaker, and the cracks in his story became more apparent. Despite his attempts to present himself as a victim of a misunderstanding, his words only fueled the growing belief that he was guilty. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of the murder of Emily Sanders. The town, which had been holding its breath, erupted into a mixture of relief and sorrow. For many, the trial had confirmed their worst fears, and Father Johnson's conviction brought a painful closure to the case. For others, especially those who had placed their unwavering faith in the Church, it was a devastating blow, shaking the very foundations of their beliefs. Father Johnson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days isolated from the world he had once controlled so easily. His once sterling reputation was forever tarnished, and the Church, too, had to face the consequences of his actions. Attendance at services plummeted, and many parishioners found themselves questioning the institution they had once trusted blindly. In the aftermath, the community slowly began the healing process. Emily's family, while grateful for justice, remained forever changed by the loss of their daughter. They continued their work through the foundation established in her name, advocating for awareness and support for those in abusive or controlling relationships. Emily's story, though tragic, became a beacon of change, helping others to speak out before it was too late. As for the town, the shadow of Father Johnson's betrayal lingered for years, a reminder of how even the most trusted figures could hide the darkest secrets. As the trial of Father Johnson unfolded, the courtroom became a tense battleground of facts and testimonies, with every word further deepening the divide between his defense and the prosecution. The analysis of Emily's phone messages revealed a chilling pattern. In these messages, she confided her fears and expressed a clear desire to end her meetings with the priest. Emily's increasingly desperate tone was a stark contrast to Father Johnson's replies, which urged her to keep their encounters secret and maintained a manipulative hold over her. This revelation became a turning point in the trial. The prosecutor pointed out that the messages not only confirmed an inappropriate relationship but also showed that Emily was afraid and trying to escape the situation, a fear that tragically culminated in her murder. Witness testimonies from Emily's friends, who noticed changes in her behavior, painted a picture of a young girl trapped in a relationship she could not openly talk about. One friend recalled how Emily had become withdrawn and anxious in the months leading up to her death, a fact that the prosecution used to establish a pattern of psychological control exerted by the priest. The prosecution argued that when Emily finally tried to break free, Father Johnson, feeling his authority threatened, reacted violently. The defense team struggled to counter this damning evidence. They continued to argue that the meetings were spiritual in nature, but the constant flow of evidence, from the DNA on the candlestick to the phone records, made their defense seem increasingly flimsy. Even their claim that the crime could have been committed by someone else began to lose traction as the timeline of events and forensic evidence closed in on Father Johnson. As the trial moved into its final phase, the prosecutor made an impassioned closing statement, emphasizing the betrayal of trust by a man who was meant to guide and protect his parish. The weight of evidence, the phone messages, and the DNA left no room for doubt, he argued. Father Johnson had abused his position to manipulate a vulnerable girl, and when she tried to escape, he resorted to murder to maintain control. The defense, in their final argument, appealed to the jury's emotions, suggesting that the case had been blown out of proportion and that the priest had simply been misunderstood. They painted Father Johnson as a man of God who had become entangled in a tragic misunderstanding, claiming there was no definitive proof of his intent to kill Emily. But the jury was not swayed by the defense's emotional pleas. After days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict that shook the town to its core, guilty of premeditated murder. The courtroom fell silent as Father Johnson stood motionless, absorbing the weight of the jury's decision. The conviction marked the end of one of the most shocking trials in the town's history. Father Johnson, once seen as a pillar of the community, was now a convicted murderer. The town, grappling with the aftermath, struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. People who had once trusted him were left questioning not only their judgment but the safety of their community. Emily's family, though devastated by their loss, expressed relief that justice had finally been served. However, for many, the emotional scars left by the trial would take years to heal. The trial of Father Johnson became a lasting reminder of the darkness that can sometimes hide behind even the most respected figures. But their arguments lacked the force needed to sway the jury. As each witness took the stand, a clearer picture of Father Johnson's manipulation and control over Emily emerged. His defense team desperately tried to claim that the priest's relationship with Emily was purely pastoral and that any signs of pressure were misinterpreted. However, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of the church employee, who had observed Father Johnson locking his office doors after services, painted a disturbing image of secrecy. Combined with the mobile data expert's recovery of deleted messages and the psychologist's analysis of Emily's deteriorating mental state, it became clear that Emily had been psychologically trapped. The prosecution presented the priest not only as a manipulator, but as someone who had carefully orchestrated his actions to maintain control over a vulnerable young girl. The defense attempted one final tactic, casting doubt on the forensic evidence. They tried to argue that the candlestick, though found in Father Johnson's study, could have been tampered with or handled by others. But when the forensic expert confirmed, with unwavering confidence, that the fingerprints and blood traces belonged to both Emily and the priest, the defense's argument crumbled. In a last-ditch effort, Father Johnson's lawyers suggested that another person could have been involved in the crime, perhaps someone from the church who had access to the priest's office. But this line of defense fell flat. The prosecution had built an airtight case, one in which the evidence consistently pointed back to the priest as the sole perpetrator. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become tense and emotionally charged. Parishioners who had once supported Father Johnson were now seeing him in a new light. Whispers of shock and disbelief spread among those in attendance. How could a man they trusted to guide them spiritually betray that trust in such a horrific way? As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing statement, summarizing the mountain of evidence against Father Johnson. They highlighted the psychological manipulation, the damning phone messages, and the forensic evidence, emphasizing that Emily's death was the tragic result of her attempt to escape the priest's control. The defense's closing arguments were somber and subdued. They pleaded with the jury to consider the possibility of a tragic misunderstanding, but their earlier confidence had evaporated. The defense lawyers' words seemed hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. After weeks of emotional testimony and damning revelations, the jury finally deliberated. It didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. When the foreman stood to deliver the decision, the entire courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all charges. Father Johnson stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face betraying little emotion. But the weight of the decision was palpable. The once respected priest had been unmasked as a manipulative predator, responsible for the death of a vulnerable girl who had sought guidance and protection. Emily's family, sitting in the front row, broke down in tears, a mixture of sorrow and relief washing over them. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back their beloved daughter. As Father Johnson was led away in handcuffs, the town was left to grapple with the aftermath. The betrayal ran deep, and the healing process would be long. The trial had exposed the darkness lurking beneath the surface of their small community, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. In the end, the case wasn't just about Emily's tragic death, it was a reckoning for the entire town. A reminder that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Father Johnson's confession echoed through the hall. His words, heavy with guilt, shattered any remaining doubt about his involvement in Emily's death. His previously composed demeanor had crumbled, revealing the deep turmoil that had been festering within him. The once respected priest, who had been the cornerstone of the community, now stood as a man fully exposed, stripped of all his carefully built layers of trust and reverence. His voice, once authoritative, was now trembling with the weight of his actions, as though he was coming to terms with the full extent of his crimes for the first time. "I lost control," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I made mistakes." The words hung in the air, each one more damning than the last. As Father Johnson described the events leading up to Emily's death, it became painfully clear how deep his manipulation had gone. His confession painted a picture of a man who had allowed his influence over a vulnerable young girl to warp into something destructive and uncontrollable. It started as spiritual guidance, but it had twisted into a form of psychological ensnarement that Emily could not escape. "I didn't want it to end this way," he whispered, his eyes cast downward, filled with sorrow and remorse, though perhaps too little, too late. "But when she decided to leave, I couldn't just let her go." The court listened, rapt and horrified, as Father Johnson described how, in a moment of overwhelming jealousy and fear, he had lashed out at the one person who had dared to sever the ties of his control. His confession laid bare the darkness of his emotions, his inability to let go, and the tragic culmination of that destructive obsession. When he spoke of striking Emily with the candlestick, his voice grew softer, almost as if he was trying to distance himself from the reality of what he had done. "I grabbed the candlestick. I didn't realize that I was killing her." The last words were barely a whisper, and yet they carried the weight of the entire tragedy. The room remained frozen, the gravity of his confession settling over everyone. The once blind trust the town had placed in Father Johnson was now irrevocably shattered. For some, the moment was a mixture of disbelief and grief. For others, it was the painful confirmation of the suspicions they had been unwilling to voice. The victim, Emily, was no longer just a name or a symbol of the tragedy. Their beloved priest had admitted to being the cause of her death. The once celebrated leader of their community was now a man who would face the full consequences of his actions. Father Johnson's confession brought a sense of closure to the courtroom, but it also raised new questions about the nature of trust, manipulation, and the fine line between authority and abuse of power. The town, once proud to call him a leader, now found itself grappling with the fallout of betrayal on a scale they had never imagined. The prosecutor, though visibly shaken by the emotional weight of the confession, pressed forward, detailing the legal implications of Father Johnson's admission. His confession had sealed his fate. There would be no acquittal, no chance of redemption through the legal system. Emily's family, who had sat through the long, harrowing days of the trial, could only watch as the man responsible for their daughter's death finally acknowledged the horror he had inflicted. While they had long suspected the truth, hearing it from Father Johnson himself was a bitter, painful moment. Justice had been served, but it came at the cost of their peace. As the trial drew to a close, Father Johnson was led away, his expression hollow, his confession the last blow to the faith his parishioners had once placed in him. The town was left to pick up the pieces, its trust in the priest, and perhaps even in its spiritual leaders, forever broken. Tensing was handed down. The town had already come to terms with the fact that their once trusted priest was guilty of first-degree murder. However, accepting that reality was an entirely different matter. The silence that followed his conviction seemed deafening, as people struggled to comprehend the depth of betrayal from a man they had once revered. The prosecutor's closing statement had been powerful, emphasizing how Father Johnson had used his position of power to manipulate and control Emily. The truth was now undeniable, and the full weight of his crimes settled heavily on the community. The defense, acknowledging the hopelessness of their position, offered only a brief statement of repentance. Father Johnson, despite his confession, maintained that it had been a tragic mistake, further deepening the divide between him and the people who had once trusted him. When the judge announced the life sentence without parole, Father Johnson's face remained stoic, though his eyes betrayed the deep turmoil within. The shock that reverberated through the town was palpable. It wasn't just the crime that was devastating, but the realization that this man, who had once embodied their spiritual compass, had hidden such darkness behind a facade of virtue. The town, once known for its quiet and peaceful life, was now marked by the weight of this tragedy. People couldn't shake the feeling that something had been shattered beyond repair. The church, once a place of solace and community, stood empty and silent. No one knew when, or if, it would ever reopen. Some proposed tearing it down, viewing the building as a symbol of betrayal. Others held on to a faint hope that, one day, a new priest could restore their faith, though the scars left by Father Johnson's actions seemed too deep to heal quickly. For Emily's family, the pain was unimaginable. Her mother, lost in grief, could barely speak of the tragedy. Her father, too, struggled to find meaning in the senseless loss of their daughter. Justice had been served, but it was of little comfort in the face of such overwhelming grief. Emily's story, once just a local tragedy, became a national one. News outlets across the country reported on the fall of the priest who had once been the spiritual leader of a small town. The scandal rocked not only the town but the broader community, as the story of abuse of power and manipulation made its way into the public consciousness. The town itself tried to move on, but it was clear that the events surrounding Emily's murder had left an indelible mark. Conversations about trust, authority, and the hidden dangers in seemingly safe places became common. Parents talked more openly with their children about safeguarding against manipulation, and schools began to implement more stringent guidelines to protect young people. The town's sense of security, which had once been taken for granted, was forever altered. Years passed, but the memory of Emily's death lingered. The memorial stone erected at the spot where she had been found became a place of reflection and mourning. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, flowers and candles were placed there, a solemn reminder of the life lost too soon. Even as the town grew older and new generations emerged, the lessons learned from that tragedy remained. Father Johnson, meanwhile, spent his days in prison, isolated from the rest of the inmate population due to fears of retribution. Despite his public confession, he continued to express remorse only in the vaguest terms, still clinging to the idea that his actions had been a tragic mistake. He had, in his own mind, become a victim of circumstance, unable to fully come to terms with the horror of what he had done. His prison life was one of solitude and despair, cut off from the world that had once held him in such high regard. The town, though scarred by the tragedy, ultimately found a way to persevere. The memory of Father Johnson's betrayal and Emily's murder would forever be etched into their collective consciousness, but over time, the community sought to rebuild its trust in each other. They learned to be more cautious, more questioning of authority figures, and more aware of the subtle ways in which power could be abused. Though the town would never be the same, the legacy of Emily's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most trusted and revered figures can harbor darkness. In their hearts, the people of the town carried both the sorrow of what had happened and the resolve to prevent such horrors from happening again. And while the church stood closed, the lessons of the tragedy were an enduring beacon, guiding future generations to be vigilant and discerning in their relationships with authority and power. As the years passed, the town's wounds began to scab over, but the scars of Father Johnson's betrayal and Emily's death remained deeply etched in the community's collective memory. The church, once the heart of the town, stood abandoned, its doors sealed shut and its pews empty. Some said it was a place of broken trust, a symbol of the deep fracture in their faith, while others believed that it should remain as a monument to the tragedy, a reminder of the vulnerability of human nature, no matter how virtuous someone may appear. The local newspapers, once filled with stories of everyday life and community happenings, continued to revisit the story of Emily's death periodically, especially on the anniversary of her death. It was as if the town couldn't entirely let go. Each year, the memorial stone erected at the place where Emily had been found became a site of remembrance. Some visitors laid flowers or lit candles, while others, perhaps more silently, stood in contemplation. It became a place where grief and loss were shared among strangers, each feeling the weight of the tragedy in their own way. For Emily's family, the pain never fully healed. Her mother, who had once been full of life and warmth, became a shadow of the person she had been. She spent most of her days in her home, surrounded by the memories of the daughter she had lost. Her father, though more active in his mourning, could barely cope with the profound sense of helplessness that came with the loss of his child. The passing years brought no closure, they only deepened their grief. Despite the sense that justice had been served, their pain remained raw and unrelenting. Father Johnson, in the confines of his prison cell, became a figure of both pity and revulsion. His once respected name had been tarnished beyond recognition. In the cold, quiet isolation of his prison, he was forced to face the full extent of his actions, though he still struggled to fully understand them. He would occasionally send letters to the town, asking for forgiveness or expressing regret, but the responses were few and far between, and each letter went unanswered. The town had moved on, or at least had tried to, and Father Johnson's desperate attempts to reach out felt like a futile plea for absolution. In prison, he spent his days reading scripture, but even his devoutness became a hollow echo in the empty chambers of his mind. His attempts at redemption fell on deaf ears. He knew the public would never forgive him, and though he was physically isolated from the world, the emotional isolation was far more punishing. He had once been revered, trusted, and admired by so many, but now he was just another convicted murderer, his name synonymous with the deepest betrayal. The town's younger generation grew up hearing the story of Emily's murder and Father Johnson's fall from grace. It became a part of the local lore, discussed in hushed tones, a warning of how appearances can deceive and how even those entrusted with the greatest responsibilities can fall prey to their own flaws. The older residents, many of whom had known Father Johnson personally, had a harder time letting go of their memories of the man they had once revered. For them, the story was not just a distant tragedy, it was a personal loss of faith and trust. Yet despite the overwhelming sorrow, there were signs of hope in the town's future. The younger generation, though haunted by the past, had learned from it. Conversations about the dangers of abuse of power and the importance of maintaining one's moral compass became common in schools and community gatherings. Parents became more vigilant, more protective, more attuned to the subtle signs of manipulation, especially in relationships where power dynamics were at play. In an effort to rebuild the community's spiritual life, a new leader eventually emerged. This new priest, different in demeanor and character from Father Johnson, was received with caution at first. People were hesitant to trust anyone who stood in the church's pulpit. But over time, as the priest quietly proved his integrity through his actions and words, a small but growing number of parishioners returned to the church. The rebuilding of faith would take time, but the new priest was committed to restoring what had been broken, to making the church once again a place of refuge for those seeking solace. However, the healing was slow. Trust, once shattered, was not easily repaired. There were still many who could not bear to return to the place where Father Johnson had so fundamentally betrayed them. For some, the scars were too deep, and they chose to seek spiritual solace elsewhere. The church building remained a symbol of the pain that had once gripped the town, a reminder of how easily faith could be shaken and destroyed. Years later, a local historian wrote a book chronicling the events that had transpired in the town. The book was both a reflection on the tragedy and an exploration of how such horrors can hide in plain sight. The historian sought to analyze the roots of Father Johnson's manipulations and the broader implications of the case, not just for the town but for society at large. The book was widely discussed and debated, offering a broader perspective on the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining moral vigilance, especially in positions of authority. In the end, the story of Emily and Father Johnson became more than just a local tragedy. It became a cautionary tale that transcended the town's borders. It was a story that reminded everyone of the fragility of trust, the depths of human complexity, and the need for constant self-awareness and accountability in the face of power. Though the town slowly moved on, the memory of what had happened remained an indelible part of its history, a permanent reminder of the dark undercurrents that can exist even in the most peaceful and seemingly safe places. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but one that would ensure that future generations would never forget. The story of Emily's tragic end and Father Johnson's downfall would echo through the years, a solemn testament to the dangers of misplaced trust and the need to protect the vulnerable from those who seek to exploit their power. As the years continued to pass, the shadow of Emily's tragedy remained a quiet but persistent presence in the town, and its impact became more ingrained in the fabric of everyday life. While some residents tried to forget the nightmare that had overtaken their peaceful community, others found that their lives had been irrevocably changed, their perspectives shifted. The town schools, once focused on teaching the next generation how to navigate life's challenges in simple terms, now incorporated discussions on ethics, trust, and personal boundaries as part of their curriculum. Students learned about the abuse of power and the signs of manipulation, topics that were now seen as essential in a world where the line between right and wrong was not always clear. Teachers and counselors made it their mission to educate children about their personal rights and the importance of speaking up when something felt wrong. Parents, too, took a more active role in guiding their children. They became more involved in their lives, not just in their schooling, but in the friendships they formed and the influences they allowed into their lives. The lessons learned from Emily's death were not just passed down through the educational system, but were shared at dinner tables, in quiet conversations between neighbors, and during late-night chats among friends. The tragedy had taught them that trust, once broken, could leave an irreparable wound that lingered for generations. In the years following Father Johnson's conviction, there were attempts to address the deeper issues within the church. The diocese, while still reeling from the scandal, began taking measures to implement stricter guidelines regarding the conduct of clergy members. They established regular counseling sessions for priests and initiated more thorough background checks for anyone entering religious service. However, many in the town felt that these changes were too little, too late. The damage had already been done, and their faith in the church had been shattered. The church itself, once a symbol of comfort and community, remained closed, its doors locked tight. Despite occasional discussions about reopening it or perhaps even demolishing it entirely, the building sat dormant, serving as a reminder of the betrayal and the dark history that it now carried. Some townspeople couldn't even bear to walk past it, while others hoped that, in time, it might be restored as a place of healing, a monument not just to loss, but to recovery, as long as it was under new leadership and guidance. Father Johnson's time in prison stretched on, his isolation and remorse deepening. Though his attempts to seek forgiveness continued, he remained unable to confront the magnitude of his crimes fully. His letters, though pleading, were viewed by the outside world as attempts to absolve himself, and the few people who read them did so with a mixture of skepticism and pity. Father Johnson's reputation, once untouchable, had become a case study in the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for abuse even in the most revered institutions. In prison, he lived a monotonous existence, cut off from all but the occasional interaction with prison staff and the few inmates who were assigned to work with him. Some of the prisoners, when they learned of his identity, refused to be near him, disgusted by his crimes. He was kept apart from the general population for his own safety, but this isolation only deepened his sense of guilt and despair. Though he tried to convince himself that his actions had been the result of a tragic mistake, deep down he knew that what he had done could never be undone. The faces of Emily and her grieving family haunted him. Years passed, and the town's memory of Emily's death, though still present, began to fade into the past. New stories emerged, new events took place, and the town started to rebuild itself. But the collective consciousness of the community had forever been marked by the events of that fateful trial. For many, it would be a lesson carried with them into the future. The memorial for Emily remained at the site where she had been found, and it became a place where not only her memory was honored, but also the memory of a town that had lost its innocence. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, the town gathered to remember, not just Emily, but the lessons of that dark time. Candles were lit, flowers were laid, and for a brief moment, the town stopped to reflect on the fragility of trust and the importance of vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. Over time, the story of Emily and Father Johnson became a haunting but necessary chapter in the town's history. It was recounted in conversations between old friends, it appeared in local history books, and it lingered in the collective memory as a somber warning. It was a story of the dangers of blind faith, of the capacity for cruelty that can lie hidden behind the most trusted facades, and of the need to question authority when something feels wrong. And though the town never fully recovered from the trauma of the tragedy, its people learned to live with the memory of what had happened, trying to turn their sorrow into something more positive. They grew more connected, more vigilant, and more aware of the need to protect the most vulnerable among them. They became a community that no longer trusted blindly but instead had learned to question, to listen, and to care. In the end, the story of Father Johnson and Emily was not just one of tragedy and loss, it was one of resilience and awareness. Though the town could not undo the past, it was determined that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. The dark chapter in their history had taught them to value not just their faith, but also their ability to protect one another from the shadows that can lurk in the most unexpected places.